Welcome to session 3 in our relationship series. We will probably say this every session, but this entire series boils down to learning how your head and your heart can work together. The RAM captures both the head and the heart and helps you visualize how much you're getting to know a partner, along with how you're developing your levels of trust, reliance, and commitment, as well as how far you have gone in your physical touch. Keeping a good pace in these areas is how you will guard your heart while also using your head.
You know, and there's such a logical sequence to this model and how it reflects what goes on in your relationships and helps you to know how to really build a safe and healthy relationship. We call it the safe zone. Somewhat intuitive. What you know should set the ceiling of how much you should trust. And as you develop a trust in somebody, that tells you how much you should depend on them or rely on them. And what you know, trust, and rely on somebody should help you know how far you should go in your commitment. And your commitment and physical touch should not ever extend farther than what you know, trust, or rely.
Of course, just because a level goes up does not mean you have to move up all the other levels, like touch, for example. You know, some singles have set clear physical boundaries in their relationships.
So true. And definitely, it's a wise thing to do and very biblical. In fact, I've known singles who do not want to even kiss prior to marriage. I'm not suggesting that this is the specific boundary for everyone, but making sure that you actually do set boundaries is crucial to following God's plan and really staying in the safe zone.
Yeah, in fact, when you guard your heart and keep your relationship growing at a safe and healthy pace, you allow for those 3 T's of really getting to know someone to come out, that talking, togetherness, and time. This helps you to figure out what are the exceptions and what are the patterns. Also, pacing your relationship like this also allows you the time to deeply explore the 5 areas that are predictive of what a partner will really be like. So, to make it easy to remember, we're using the acronym FACES. So just like people have different faces, and as you begin to get to know someone, you'll begin to see their different sides. So, in the last session, we looked at the ways family background can influence how a person will think and act in their relationships. And in this session, we're going to talk about 2 more areas to explore: the attitudes and actions of your conscience and your compatibility potential.
So let's start with conscience. It's true, a person's conscience will definitely impact their attitudes and actions. And isn't that how you know the way that conscience is functioning? You know, it's kind of like your self-monitoring system.
Yeah, it's like your moral compass, that little voice in your head that helps you to know and then follow what you believe is right.
So this is where I get some mileage from my years of academic toil back in Greek class. The New Testament Greek word for conscience is actually a compound word that actually means to know and together, or to have 2 minds in one. It's as if we have 2 minds, one living life and the other watching, observing, commenting, trying to guide you about right and wrong, appropriate and inappropriate. So really, the conscience is a God-given capacity to watch yourself, to observe yourself and check yourself and control yourself according to your moral code. And it isn't just a mental thing. I mean, your conscience will stir your emotions and, for example, make you feel guilty when you're going against what you believe is right. I think we can all relate to a time when we had an experience like my conscience was watching me and saying, "John, just shut up." You know, like my mouth wanted to say something and was talking, and my conscience was trying to shut it down, you know?
You know what, I remember one time when you asked a class to come up with a definition of conscience, and someone yelled out, "The voice of God."
Yes, I remember that.
Well, that would be so great if our consciences were totally tuned in to the voice of God. But even the scriptures acknowledge that some people's consciences just don't work that well. They can be immature, or they can even be hardened. And then there are those consciences that are so overly sensitive that you just feel guilty about everything, and you feel guilty even when you shouldn't. We see this with some of the Corinthian Christians in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. So the bottom line is this: we all have the God-given capacity for a conscience, but definitely not all consciences work the same. And much of how someone will act in a relationship is determined by the strength and the maturity of their conscience.
So true. I remember this landmark study that should just be mentioned because it really illustrates how the conscience works, how predictive it is for how an individual will act in life and ultimately in relationships. Do you remember the Walter Mischel study?
I do, yeah.
It's that marshmallow study. He did it back in the 1960s, actually.
It's such a fun and funny study. So basically, Mischel took around 1,500 4-year-olds, one at a time, and he would take them and he would put them in a testing room, and he would sit there and he would watch them through a double-sided mirror, but he would put a marshmallow right in front of them on a plate, and he would say, "You can eat this marshmallow right away, but if you just want to wait till I come back, then I'll give you another marshmallow so you can have 2. But if you didn't want to wait, you could just go ahead and eat the marshmallow immediately. But remember,
you won't get the second one.
Right, but remember, you won't get the second one if you don't wait." So Mischel would leave each 4-year-old in the room with the marshmallow, watch them through a two-way mirror for about 15 minutes, which is a lifetime.
That's a lifetime for a 4-year-old, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. So, of course, some preschoolers did not eat the marshmallow, but most of them did during those 15 minutes. Was really, really hilarious. So they would smell it, they would spin it, they would pick at it, they would taste little pieces, they would lick it. Some people would put it off to the side and just not look at it because it was too tempting.
Some of them sat on their hands.
You should YouTube it, actually.
It's pretty funny.
Really funny. You can watch it. But there were those kids who ate the marshmallow before he had even finished the instructions.
What'd you say?
Yeah.
That's the impulsive kids. For sure, right?
Absolutely. But what's so fascinating about this study was that when Mischel recontacted these kids years later, he found that what they did with the marshmallow predicted grades in school, emotional controls, achievement, and relationship quality. And then with additional follow-up assessments, he found that it even predicted marital quality and longevity.
Mischel's research is usually tagged as a study in the delay of gratification, but I think it really comes under the umbrella of the conscience. Because the conscience is not just a moral code or a set of beliefs that you have in your head. It's actually there's a measure of willpower that goes into the conscience. So you could say that the conscience has both the code and the enforcer. There's some people who know that they should not do something. Their moral code is speaking clearly, don't do it,
but they always break their code.
They always break their code. So some people are always apologizing and breaking their conscience, but then kind of realigning, getting set, and then breaking it again. So I think this area that you're talking about willpower, being able to delay gratification, is so valuable in understanding in the overall conscience. Some people can follow their conscience and they have that good moral code that is also reinforced by a good enforcer. But there's some people, they're just always eating the marshmallow.
And when you think about how a partner's conscience will ultimately impact your relationship bonds, well, just look at the ram. You can see what will be impacted by the conscience. Will they stick with their commitments? Can you rely on them? Can you trust them? If my partner doesn't have a well-functioning conscience, then how will they act when I'm not there? Can I even trust them?
Have you ever seen someone who has to be their partner's conscience? I mean, it's like, now, when we go to their house, please just be nice. Don't push anybody's buttons and change your shirt. That could be okay.
Yeah.
That could be okay for a parent, but why do you have to parent your partner? Because of their conscience, basically. So
what we've said so far is that the conscience watches your thoughts, your words, your actions, and it measures them by your moral code, which, by the way, should be shaped by the scriptures and the Holy Spirit. And the conscience has some degree of willpower, which again should be strengthened and empowered by the Holy Spirit.
But there is another way your conscience works, which is kind of the same, but a little bit different. You know, the conscience also observes and guides you by another code. It's the code of how you are impacting those around you, especially those you care about.
Yeah, so this would be like my conscience saying, Morgan, stop doing what you're doing and think about how this will make Chad feel. Or Morgan, you need to do this because it will make Chad feel really supported. So basically my conscience is still observing and guiding me, but in this way it's helping me to have empathy, to have understanding, of how I'm affecting others. So it's transporting me out of my own perspective and putting me in the perspective of another.
This is often what we mean by the word conscientious, to be thoughtful, empathetic, sensitive to another person's feelings.
Yeah, feeling that your partner understands what you're going through and is conscientious, thoughtful, empathetic. This is so important in marriage. And it's so essential to make sure you figure out what the conscience is really like in the person that you're dating.
And sometimes the person that you're dating, their conscience is really obvious. But a lot of times you have to add up the little deals to figure out what is the big deal of the conscience. So don't just pay attention to big things and don't overlook the little deals. I've found that sometimes good-hearted people, they're the most at risk to get involved with a person that has problems and stay with them because they're always overlooking these little deals. So pay attention to the conscience. Look at how the person's conscience regulates themselves, how they monitor themselves, how they act, but also look at how they're able to transport themselves into your world, how they're able to feel empathetic or really understand you. Add up these little deals. Look at how their conscience actually relates to other people in their life. Add these things up because bottom line, that conscience is one of the strongest predictors of what they'll be like in the long term of life and in any long-term relationship, especially marriage. So the next area that is important to explore is the C in faces, and this refers to the compatibility potential you have with another person. So a big question is, how do you know if you're compatible with somebody or not?
For me, it just starts with common interests, really seeing the person as someone that I would like to spend time with.
If you can be yourself completely with another person, then you know that you're compatible with that person.
It's probably several things. One, of course, is physical attractiveness. Do we have things in common?
I think it takes a lot of time. I think you have to be with somebody, you have to spend a lot of time talking to them.
I don't know if it's so much a type of person that I'm compatible with, but it's a person that I could see myself interacting well with. We don't have to be the same person. We don't have to be opposites of each other.
I think compatibility, in my experience, is way less of an event and a lot more of a process and an experience.
When I think of compatibility, for me, I think about friendship even before dating. So I think about what that person values, how they treat their friends, as well as I think about their interests and their personality type. Again, communication.
You can talk about things that you like to do and places you've been and things that you want to do. You can spend all day doing that, but I don't think a lot of people spend as much time, or it's not as much of a priority to talk about your spiritual aspect.
So sometimes trying to figure out compatibility can be pretty complicated. So we're going to try to make this easy to figure out and give you 3 areas of compatibility that we're going to suggest you explore: your personalities, your values, and your lifestyles.
Let's start with personality. How can you know if your personalities are truly compatible?
Yeah, well, there are a number of traits and personality factors to consider. And you can always, take a personality and compatibility test online.
Seems to be lots of them online,
Yeah.
especially on those dating sites.
Yeah, but, a good starting point is to have 3 litmus tests. The first is chemistry. How are we attracted to each other? How do we click together? The second is comparability. So how are we similar? And then the last is complementarity. And this is really how we blend our differences together.
So let's begin with chemistry. You know, you got to have chemistry, and you need to have it in a number of different ways, right? You got to be attracted, which sometimes is immediate.
Yeah, I mean, some say within seconds, you know, they know if they can have a good chemistry with someone or not.
But then there are those that develop like a great friendship first,
Yeah.
and they feel an attraction later. Chemistry comes later. But in either case, you got to have good chemistry. I think that is a must.
Yeah, you know, and by the way, you got to make sure it's not fleeting. I mean, for me, there were times that I dated guys in the past, and I thought initially we had a good chemistry, but then in a pretty short amount of time, it just kind of fizzled out. And I don't know if this is everybody's experience, but after I dated these guys for a little bit, I felt kind of, I call it icked out. It's like the ick factor, you know, and I'm sure they would not have affected other people that way, but for me, once that set in, it was over.
And it's important to say that just because you have great chemistry doesn't mean that person is actually going to be great for you. Some people have really defective radar, and they tend to get, chemistry with the crazies.
Yeah, and chemistry, is not just attraction. There's also that chemistry of how you talk. We talk about this, like how you click together. Do you have that click factor?
I've talked with some people, speaking of the click factor, they're just so difficult to have a conversation with because I'll get done saying something. It's like we have two different rhythms, and then there's this long pause, and then I'm like, is there anybody in there?
Yeah.
What's going on?
Well, this aspect of chemistry begins to overlap with the second area of comparability, or in what ways are we similar? So are we outgoing, or what are our energy levels like? Do we click there? How do we think? Do we think similarly? Or do we have similar emotional makeup? These are the aspects of personality that help you click with someone and get along because you're cut from, the same mold.
I think the similarity is most important for having similar values, Research has shown that sharing common values, especially your faith values and your faith practices, is strongly related to relationship satisfaction. And there is that broad statement made in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. It says, do not be yoked together with non-believers. A yoke, is a wood harness that would hold animals together, like oxen. The idea is this: when you're in a relationship, relationships bind you with another person. So if one person's going one direction, then you're probably going to end up going that direction with them. In many ways, marriage is binding so that the values of your partner end up directing the trajectory of your relationship. I know in my marriage, for Shirley and I, our faith and especially our spiritual practices have been so vital to how we've raised our kids, how we work together with differences, how we just support each other.
This is so true. To some extent, also, you want to look at similarities in lifestyle. So look at the ways you click in your lifestyle. What do you do for recreation? What do you do for fun? What's your work ethic and your practices, your interests, your priorities? So even your eating habits, right? You might want to click there. So these lifestyle preferences are also really important to be similar.
Wait a minute, what about that opposites attract stuff, okay? That obviously means that there are some differences and they're quite magnetic. So what about our differences? So we've been talking about being similar, but I think we need to talk about differences too.
Yeah, and that's the third, litmus test, and that's complementarity. So I think that this word was actually coined by researchers in the field of marriage studies. You see, compatibility of partners was the first major area of relationship studies. And for the most part, it always was looking at how two people are the same, comparable. But then researchers asked the question, how do two people make their differences benefit the relationship? And that's what they called a couple's complementarity.
Oh, to quote a well-known movie, you complete me.
So, when you're dating someone, check out the chemistry of both attraction and personality. Check out the comparability of how you're similar, but then also look at the ways you blend your differences with each other. So as your relationship grows and some differences emerge, do you admire and respect these differences, or do they begin to create, more friction in the relationship?
Yeah, I like to think of the differences between your mother and I as really sources of admiration and respect that hopefully she would want to be more like me as we continue to grow in our relationship. But I know for sure I've always admired things about her, and I actually try to emulate them. There's a kind of a litmus test, to add another one to this, that I call the end of the day. At the end of the day, how do the differences affect you? So I always say, at the end of the day, am I running for the door, or am I wanting a little more? It's a good way to try to think of how differences blend together. Another example, by the way, is Mary and Joseph in the New Testament, the parents of Jesus. They seem to have some striking differences in personality, but definite similarities in faith and their values.
Yeah, like Joseph and Mary both had a strong faith and devotion. They're both really involved with the parenting process, and they share the same family values and conscientiousness toward each other. But Joseph appeared to be pretty quiet, gentle, and thoughtful. And in fact, there's actually no place in any of the Gospels where something he said is even recorded.
There's a man for you right there.
Never talks to me.
Never talks.
But in contrast, Mary was really social and communicative. She had a conversation with an angel when he visited her about her pregnancy, and then went on and stayed with her cousin Elizabeth for 3 months.
And then, of course, that Song of Mary, also known as the Magnificat, that's a literary masterpiece. So she could definitely use her words very well.
Yeah, she was reflective and real understanding oriented. She treasured things up in her heart, so the scriptures say.
On the other hand, Joseph was more oriented toward action. In fact, it's kind of funny, 3 times God spoke to him in a dream, and it says that he immediately arose and acted on whatever those instructions were from God. A lot of times, several times it was to leave the city and go someplace else. So kind of makes you wonder if Mary had a certain prayer before she went to sleep. Please, God, don't give Joseph another dream. I just want to get my rest tonight.
So I just want to wrap up this discussion on compatibility. When you're in a relationship, you need to look at your personalities, your values, and your lifestyles, and see what kind of chemistry you have with each other.
Make sure it's a two-way street, right?
Absolutely.
You've got to be attracted to that person, but they've got to have a good attraction and chemistry with you as well.
For sure. And second, what is your comparability? Meaning, what are your similarities? And then lastly, how do you blend your differences in respectful, admiring ways, and then build positive complementarity?
And don't just look at compatibility. What we said was also look at the person's conscience. Going back to the first session, people who are never willing to make any personal changes for a partner, they become so difficult to live with in a relationship. And the conscience is often the internal engine that drives thoughtfulness, apologies, personal integrity, a feeling of understanding and empathy, a loving conscientiousness for another. Look for these qualities and make sure there's a good balance of compatibility. Check out the health of how your partner's conscience directs their attitudes and actions. And these 2 areas will be very predictive of what this person will be like, not only in their life, but in a relationship.